You are listening to Latinx America, a podcast focused on highlighting catalysts who are using, leveraging, or creating technology to help our community achieve more. With your host, Adriana Flores Ragade. This week, we highlight Pablo Navarro. Pablo is a managing partner at Macondo Venture Partners, which is an early-stage venture capital fund that invests in Latin American startups. Most recently, he was a senior director at Code 2040, which is where I met him, a nonprofit that supports Black and Latinx technologists in the U.S. At Code 2040, he oversaw the business development function of the organization, increasing program revenues by 50% in a year. In addition to leading the business development team, he closed new and renewed partnerships worth of $1.7 million. Pablo also led Code 2040's finance department. Prior to joining Code 2040, Pablo was VP of Business Operations at Sorcery Technologies, a Y Combinator startup that helps restaurants manage their finances. At Sorcery, Pablo built and ran the company's account management, sales, and operations teams. He built tools and processes that allowed the company to increase revenue by 10 times and triple its headcount. In addition to his job responsibilities, Pablo also stewarded work on company culture. He was interim CEO for a time and solidified Sorcery's guiding principles. Prior to Sorcery, Pablo worked at Amazon, where he launched and ran several multi-million-dollar business units, including Amazon's flower business and its B2B food business. He also co-founded Amazon's Latinx affinity group, Latinos at Amazon. Before working at Amazon, Pablo worked as a consultant for Ernst & Young, managing projects in the U.S. and Latin America. Hola, Pablo. Thanks for joining us today. Let's start by learning about your personal journey into tech.
Absolutely. So I was born in Colombia, and I moved to the U.S. in 2004 to study mathematical economics. After that, I lived in Chicago, where I worked as a consultant at Ernst & Young, and I was also pretty involved with the Latino community there. I was on the board of ALPFA, which is the Association of Latino Professionals in Finance and Accounting, and that's really Chicago is where I got my first exposure to the tech scene. So originally through the Chicago Innovation Awards, the Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year Awards, a startup that I started helping a friend of mine with, and ultimately Sandbox Industries, which is a VC fund, where I spent some time interning right before business school and during business school. After I did my MBA at TUC, which is Dartmouth Business School, I worked at Amazon, where my job was to launch and grow new business units. The main project that I worked on was our flower business, which I was able to grow revenue by about 6x in about a year, and income I was able to more than triple our profit margins in that same period of time. Amazing experience. While I was there, I learned a lot. I also co-founded Latinos at Amazon, which is the Latino affinity group at Amazon. After being there for a little bit, I really wanted to go back to a more early stage startup. And I moved to San Francisco to work with Sorcery, which is a food tech startup. And there, the company had just gone through Y Combinator. They had raised at the time about $4 million. And my role there was really to, start and grow the different departments at Sorcery. And that included account management, that included operations. And then when our VP of sales left, I ended up taking over sales and marketing. I spent there about 2 years, a little less than 2 years. For me, I've always been very conscious of the privilege that I've had growing up, in Colombia. And I've always noticed that, whenever I would go into finance or I would go into tech, there really weren't a lot of people that looked like me or had a similar background. So supporting the Latino community, the Latinx community, in tech has always been really important.
Thanks, Pablo. We need people like you who are in places where we don't normally see other Latinx and who have a passion for helping our community. Now, can you share with us a bit about why you chose to move into the entrepreneurship and tech space? And also, did it have anything to do with your earlier experience or the networks you created?
Absolutely, that's a great question. I moved into the tech industry and to the entrepreneurship space because I love it. I was drawn to it. Both my parents are entrepreneurs. When I was in high school, I always had a couple of side businesses. When I graduated and started working at Ernst & Young, I always had side projects. And, there's something for me, I really enjoy um, the fast pace of an entrepreneurial environment. I really enjoy the impact. And I'm also somebody who really enjoys going into a place where there's a lot of chaos and building a little bit of order and structure. Not too much, but just the right amount of order and structure. I had my first exposure to entrepreneurship when I started helping a friend of mine on a startup that she was working on. And I just really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the experience and the space. And the more time that I spend working with entrepreneurs, investing in startups, working in startups, the more it validates that fit and that desire to be in that space, and the fact that I enjoy being in it.
It's impressive that from a very young age, you were already launching ventures. You're talking about high school. As a managing partner at Macondo Venture Partners, what are some of your responsibilities?
So right now I'm working in the extremely unsexy task of filling out all the paperwork and making sure that all the legal terms are in place so that we can legally fundraise in Colombia and the US. Colombia has pretty stringent regulations when it comes to fundraising. I'm also spending a good amount of time meeting with startups and making a couple of investments along with my other partners and an investment bank who is serving as a strategic limited partner. We've made probably about $1.2 million in investments in different startups. So I'm spending some time making those investments and also supporting those startups. Some with raising their next round of capital, some with operational issues. And how can others follow my path? I would say that I'm a big fan of having a hypothesis, testing it, and iterating on it. So in my case, I had a hypothesis that given my background and given my connections in the US, I could add value to the startups that I invest in. So I've spent about a year working with different startups, focusing on ways to add value. And I've been able to validate that hypothesis. One of the companies that I work with, I was able to connect them with a friend of mine who was at Y Combinator at the time. That friend gave them a ton of coaching, which led to them joining the next class of Y Combinator. I also connected them to a couple other people in Silicon Valley, and they straight up told me, "Hey, listen, we would have not made it to Y Combinator if it weren't for this person. We would have not met this person if it weren't for you. Thank you." And obviously, the moment they told me that, I said, "Great, two things. One, you should stop raising money because you're going to have a much higher valuation once you go through Y Combinator. Two, please let me invest some money before you do that." And of course, they said yes. And I invested my capital because one of the things that I've been doing is I've been making angel investments and validating my hypothesis that I can add value to the companies that I invest in addition to the money. And I've been doing that, putting my own capital at risk. And I think that's important because obviously angel investments are not the same as running a fund. But for me, building that track record and learning about investments, putting my own capital at risk, is helpful. It helps me realize what I like about it, what I don't like about it. It helps me realize what I'm doing wrong. And once I've done that with my money, I can then go to investors and say, "Hey, I've learned. Here's my track record. I would love to, to invest with you. And so for me, it has been that, trying it out, and also look for a market where you have a competitive advantage. Being in Colombia, my background and skill set is very unique. And it's really, really hard to find where I'm at. If I'm staying in Silicon Valley, could I have done the same thing? Maybe, but it would have been a lot harder because I don't, my skill set is not as unique as it is here in Colombia and in Latin America.
Pablo, can you talk a little bit about how you made a successful transition from an established company to a startup, and also how others can potentially follow your steps?
I think that if you want to work at a startup, and even if you eventually want to be in an investor role, it helps a lot to work at a company that's already been successful, that is best in class at what it does. In the case of Amazon, that's operation. Like, operation is at the core of Amazon. So for me, actually working at Amazon was a huge advantage, in that when I came to the startup, to Sorcery, I could add a lot of value because I had a lot of points of reference. Obviously, small startup, very different than Amazon. But when you're at a large company, you can see what works, and you can see what scales, and you can see what things they do well and what things they didn't do well. And you can bring that to a startup, and that is extremely, extremely valuable.
Let's go back to investing in companies for a moment. You invest in companies in Latin America. Can you share how Latinx in the US can do the same? Any tips would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's two basic avenues, and I'm going to talk about each of them in detail. Um, a lot of it depends on how much you're looking to invest. So, for example, let's say that you're an ultra high net worth individual, and you have a lot of money, and you want to say, hey, like, I want to get into, I want to invest in the tech ecosystem. And you may or may not have the time to really go looking at all the different startups out there. So you invest in a fund, right? So you invest in a VC fund that's investing in Latin America. Ticket sizes, so the minimum amount that you would have to invest to be able to invest in a fund, is generally starts at about $250,000. You can also syndicate that investment, which is a fancy way of saying, get together with a bunch of friends and gather the necessary money. So you can do that, in which case you can come in at a little bit lower, probably like $50,000 to $100,000. Now that works if you have a lot of capital and you're looking to diversify. If you want to be a little bit more hands-on, or you don't really have $250,000 lying around, you can do angel investments. And what that means is that you build a one-to-one relationship with the entrepreneur. You look at the company, you believe in them, you invest. And for those investments, most companies are looking at 20 to 25K. But some companies, especially if you go at an earlier stage, could probably let you in for about 15K. The biggest challenge that you're going to have on the angel investing side is building those relationships. So when I came to Colombia, I wanted to be an angel investor, and I probably spent about a year just meeting different startups, meeting different entrepreneurs, getting a sense for what works, who's an entrepreneur that you want to back, who's an entrepreneur that you want to invest in, what's the business model that you think will be successful. And after that due diligence is when I actually started making those investments. If you're a Latinx and you're living in the US, I think the best way to get into that world is to talk to somebody who is in the space. Like, for me, like, I'm always happy to connect the startups that I've talked to, especially the really, really good entrepreneurs, with potential investors or mentors in the US. I can be a conduit to that. If you have friends who are in the local startup ecosystem, those are also good conduits. Because what you want to do at the end of the day is like, you're not going to be able to meet 20, 30, 40, 50 entrepreneurs, right? You're not going to be able to evaluate all their business plans. So if you want to invest, and you don't necessarily want to come in and invest directly in a fund, really what you need to do is to find somebody that really knows the space and has had the time to meet 20, 30, 40, 50 different startups in the space, and can introduce you to the ones that you want to talk to because are going to be a good fit.
Let's change gears and talk about sales teams and startups based on your expertise. You recently published an article on LinkedIn about the importance of an efficient sales team to the success of a startup. Can you share some of the highlights of the importance of scaling and having an effective team in the first 3 years of a startup? Also, how do you know when you need a new team?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll tackle the first two, and I'll leave the new team one, after. I think that when you have a company, the best thing that you can do is have a hypothesis and test it, and like do what we call a minimum viable product. Let's say that you believe that there's a huge market for, I don't know, organic chia seeds in San Francisco. Like you don't want to buy a warehouse, you don't want to sign a contract with a chia seed distributor. First thing that you want to do is probably go sell some chia seeds. See how people react, see how much demand there is, see what your establish a hypothesis, test it. And you usually do that with a sales team, right? It's generally the founder, or maybe, generally one of the co-founders or one of the first hires. So that's really, I like thinking about it as an early stage of company, you have a sales team. And a sales team, it's pounding the pavement, you're getting your first customers. Some months you might be bringing in a lot of deals, some months you won't be bringing any deals, and that's okay, because that's the volatility that you need when you start a company. Once you start scaling, I like to refer of it as building a sales machine. And the reason that I like to talk about it as having a sales machine is, in order to scale, you need to minimize volatility, right? Like if you have one or two sales superstars, and 1 month they bring in 20 clients, the next month they bring 5 clients, that's doable on a small scale. But once your company grows, like you cannot have a squad of sales superstars that bring you 250 clients 1 month and 50 clients the next month, because your business won't really be able to cope with that. So that's when it's really important that you start building systems, you start building processes, you start getting a lot of data, right? Like at that point, what you're looking for in your sales team and your sales leaders are not necessarily the people that can sell ice to Eskimos, or people living in Antarctica. You are looking for people who can build a process and can iterate on it, people who are very disciplined and people who are also analytical, and will be able to build a process that can help you scale. So that's a little bit of like the importance of having an effective team. And at first it's about validating your thesis, your market, your hypothesis, and afterwards it's about building something that you can scale. When do you know you need a new team? I mean, it's a really hard question, and it depends on the company. I'm a firm believer, and like always expect the best in people. Let's say, one of the hardest things about a startup is that your needs are going to change very quickly. Your first hire, who worked with you for pizza and a stock grant and a dream of building an amazing startup, might have been that rock star salesperson. But once you get to a large scale, that person can't really be your sales lead, because you don't need a sales rock star. You need somebody who can build and maintain a process. That's going to be a different skill set. So when you need a new team, when the skill sets of the people in that team are no longer aligned with what you need. And I think that you first need to talk to those people and be absolutely transparent and say, hey, this is what worked before, this is what I need now. Here's the gaps that I'm seeing with you as an individual. Here are the places for growth. Do you want to work on this? This is what it would look like. This is the commitment that I need. These are the results that we want to see. And this is the support that you're going to have from me and the team. And then you start working with them so they can get to that point. If they cannot get to that point, then you really need to make a decision. And oftentimes that decision ends up being parting ways, which is a reality. And one of the hardest things that you'll do as a startup is you'll part ways with a lot of amazing people because their skill set is not necessarily a good fit with what you need at different stages.
So, what worked for a startup at the beginning is not necessarily the best option in later stages.
Correct. And that's why, I think it's always very important to level set and be honest with people, right? And, like even as a founder, like you might be replaced as the CEO. And at the end of the day, I think that when you have, when you've been honest with people and you align them on, hey, like we're in this for the company, ideally, we are all the best team to manage this company, but at some point things are going to change. And we have to be ready for that.
Pablo, so if someone is interested in learning more about the startup world, whether it's working in the trenches, joining a board, or maybe investing in them, are there resources that they should be tapping into to learn about the industry?
Absolutely. So I like to think of a couple of different buckets. In the one bucket, you have the secondary research, and that's going into Quora, going into AngelList, and just reading as much as you can about entrepreneurship, right? If you're in the US and you want to learn about entrepreneurship in the US, Andreessen Horowitz, Fred Wilson, like a lot of the VCs and investors that are very prominent in the US have their own blogs. They talk about it. Obviously, there are other VC funds that are focused in Latin America or Latinx community, and then just read as much as you can. Secondary research. I think the next bucket is look for people that would be open to sharing their advice. And obviously, you can go to meetups. You can work through your network, work through people that you meet, but you'd be surprised at how many people are willing to take a phone call, are willing to take a coffee chat. Not always, but it'll happen. And one of the big reasons for that is that, a lot of us, like, for me, like I had coffee chats with about 30 people when I was applying to my first job at a college. And I had a lot of people that I did not know that I emailed out of the blue and I said, hey, you're an alum at my university. I want to talk to you. And some of them didn't reply because they were busy. Some of them met with me. So, you'd be surprised because a lot of the people that have been really successful at one point or another have had a complete stranger make time for them. So that's the second piece, right? Finding people to talk to. And the third piece is, see how you can get your hands dirty. See how you can get involved in something. Like you always have to be looking for that opportunity. Like my first exposure to be transparent, like I was a tax consultant and I somehow made it from being a tax consultant to interning at a venture capital fund and going to business school and working at Amazon. Right. And, the way that I did it was I played in a soccer league and a friend of mine, his sister-in-law launched a startup and they needed people to help. And I was like, great, I'll help. I'll do whatever it takes. Like, I just want to get that exposure. And that eventually turned into an internship at the VC because company didn't go well, but she ended up going into a venture capital fund. But, like look for opportunities, like see where you can get involved. Like for me, that was, I worked in a startup during the nights and weekends while I was working a full-time job at Ernst & Young. But seize those opportunities. So to summarize, 3 buckets. One is secondary research. Just read what's out there in the internet, whether it be AngelList, Quora, or a VC fund or an entrepreneur that blogs. Second is talk to people. Third is find a way to get involved and start helping a startup.
Great advice from you. Let's talk about influencers. What tech leaders or companies do you follow and why?
Yeah. One is Ben Horowitz, who's the one of the co-founders at Andreessen Horowitz. And, what I really liked about him is that he's one of the few people in the tech industry that talk about the unsexy things about startups, the things that are really hard. And, it's going to sound a little bit cheesy, but, when I was deep in the trenches at Sorcery, we were like, the co-founders and I, like, we were all reading, this book he wrote called The Hard Things About Hard Things. And what that book really talks about all the uncomfortable things that happen at a startup, right? Like when you have to demote a friend and somebody who has been there from the beginning because they no longer have the skill set that you need. When you need to let go of people because the business line that you were in isn't really as profitable as you thought it was going to be, or because you're running out of cash and you need to redeploy resources. Those are the really hard things. And I think, like in one of my startups, we had to lay off a good number of people. And it's laying off people. Obviously, getting laid off is brutal. Laying people off is also extremely, extremely difficult. And the really hard thing is doing it right. And, when in the company that I was with, we made a bold decision. And that was to meet with all the employees and say, listen, this is where we're at. We are going to test this hypothesis and we're going to do X, Y, and Z so that we see these results in the next 3 months. If we're not there or on our way there, we're going to have to make some difficult decisions. You've all been with us from the start. We want to be completely transparent with you. And if you feel that you want to leave the company, you can let us know. We'll work with you to find the transition path so you're not left without income from one day to the next. If you want to stay, we welcome you, and we can also be flexible if you want to take interviews while you're at it, because we want to make sure that you land on your feet if things don't go well. And that was hard, right? And we were terrified when we did that because we were afraid that nobody was going to come to the office the next day. And everybody did. Everybody came back. And some people eventually left voluntarily. Some people eventually left involuntarily. But because they had that advance notice, they were able to find something else. Mm-hmm. And we also spent a ton of time, putting them in touch with our contacts. One of the people that we were working with, her dream was to get a master's in sports marketing. So I helped her, wrote recommendations. She ended up getting into Columbia's sports marketing program, ended up turning them down because she got into her dream school in Europe. And right now she's in Europe, getting her master's at a university that's a feeder to FIFA and a lot of really, really, world-renowned sports organizations. So, I admire, Ben in part because of that, right? Because he talks about the things that are really hard, the unsexy things that nobody talks about. And then the firm itself, it's because of the focus on, it's built by entrepreneurs for entrepreneurs. And that's one of the things that we really focus on in our fund. Like, I'm starting the fund because I have the experience that I gained in San Francisco, because I've been in the trenches, because I've had to hire people, because I've had to fire people, because I've had to pivot, because I had to build things. And I think that once you go through that, you can level set with entrepreneurs and be a much better investor, be a much better partner in their growth.
I agree with you when it comes to transparency, and your team really acted in a very humane way. Pablo, who has had the most influence on you personally and professionally?
Absolutely. I would say personally, it was my parents. I had the immense luck and privilege of growing up in Colombia and being born to a family that was willing and able to pay for me to have the best education in my hometown. And by the time I was a junior in high school, things in our family from a financial standpoint were really, 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 really rough. Mm-hmm. Both my parents were entrepreneurs, and both were doing really, really, they were in a really, really tough spot financially. And I remember once asking my parents, if they thought it made sense for me to graduate from another school that was perhaps a little bit cheaper. And I remember, my mom looked at me in the eye and said, listen, Si me toca empeñar hasta, hasta lo que sabemos, lo empeño, pero tutero va a tener mejor colegio. O sea, if I have, doesn't matter what I have to sell, or what I have to do, but you will graduate from the best school. And I literally saw my family like sell or put in Escalat. Like, our apartment kept getting emptier and emptier as we sold paintings, as we sold things. By the end of it, like, the lunch that we had to eat was, lunch that my dad sent us from the restaurant. And that made a really big impact in me because I saw how my parents were willing to give up anything to make sure that I had the best opportunity in life. And that obviously made me take education and business a lot more seriously. So that's on a personal standpoint, that's been a huge driver um, for me. Professionally, my previous boss who is the CEO of the company. At the time it was called Sorcery. Today it's called Restaurant Cheetah. Her name is Nama Moran. She's also a huge influence. She's probably the most determined and resilient person that I know. If she has an objective, she will not stop at anything or anyone until she achieves that objective. And she's Israeli, and not to go with stereotypes, but she's brutally honest. If she thinks something that you're saying is stupid, she will tell you. She will not spare your feelings. If she thinks something is great, she will tell you it's great. And she's also very flexible. And with her, I working with her really reinforced that radical candor notion. And she was also somebody to push me to be better, right? Like not only selling or believing in myself or helping in fundraising and financial forecasting. It's also the small things. Like I'm somebody that enjoys building relationships with people. Mm-hmm. So at times in meeting, I'm the one who stops talking the moment somebody else interrupts me. And she was really adamant at saying, Pablo, what the F? Like, just say, please let me finish and finish. And like, she would cut me off. And then she would tell me, why the heck did you let me cut you off? Like, we would be in a meeting with a co-founder and she would be like, why did you let the other co-founder cut you off? Like, what you have to say is valuable and you need to stand your ground. And that's been a huge influence on me professionally.
She sounds like a great role model, and we need to be in the lookout for those types of mentors and champions. Now let's look into the future. What's your next play, Pablo?
I'm also really, really excited for the startup ecosystem in Colombia and in Latin America more broadly. I'm really, really excited to see what the next generation of Latinx entrepreneurs can accomplish. Even more excited to see what they can accomplish once we start building those bridges, with both financial capital and human capital in the U.S. And that's really what I'm aiming for in the fund, is to really leverage what I've learned in the U.S., but also the amazing Latinx talent that I know is there, with the amazing Latinx talent that I know is here in Latin America, and really build the next generation of tech and entrepreneurial leaders in the region.
Thank you, Paulo. Thank you for speaking with us today, for the advice that you provided, and for continuing to pave the way for our Latinx community. I look forward to seeing all the wonderful things that you'll continue to do.
Thank you very much, and really grateful for the opportunity.
Some key takeaways from the conversation with Pablo suggest that you do your homework if you want to invest abroad and explore the investment options that are best suited for you. Or you can tap a company like Macondo Venture Partners that can help you or point you in the right direction. Also, when launching a new business, establish a theory, test your hypothesis by selling the product, and when you're ready to scale, build a sales machine that will help you do so. Be conscious that not all the things are rosy when scaling a startup. You will need to make tough decisions or some decisions might be made for you if you do not take action, like removing the CEO. So be prepared for anything. Finally, empathy and transparency will help you navigate the murky waters when you have to lay off people or your company must pivot in some way. We hope that the information shared by Pablo is useful to you and others who are either thinking about investing abroad or are in the middle of transitioning into a startup. You can reach Pablo at pabnavarro@gmail.com or through social media. Once again, don't forget to share this episode with others and leave a comment or review after you listen. Thanks for joining us today. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook at Latinx America and on Twitter at America Latinx, or email any questions or ideas to latinxamerica@gmail.com. Gracias y hasta la próxima semana.